Right, good. That's out. Cool.
Right.
Right. Thanks, everyone. I think we're going to get started. So, thank you all for coming. This is Professor Luke. He's going to be talking to us today. And I think it's best, if you just crack on.
Sure.
We have wasted about 15 minutes.
That's all right.
Recording. So,
right. Here I am. Hello, everyone. Thanks for coming along. Nice to see you all. Nice to be here in Cambridge. Yeah. So I'm going to give a talk. Apparently, you've been here psychedelic site for a while. Has anyone been to many live talks with the society? Oh, well, welcome. Anyone in the society? You're just here for the talk. Oh, a couple of you at least. Oh, that's good. Well, hello, everyone. So that's me. Well, not that, but the name at least, David Luke. I'm mostly based at Greenwich, and which is a kind of good place to be for it down in London, not least because for many years we ran the UK's first and largest and only psychedelic conference called Breaking Convention. Don't know if anyone's heard of Breaking Convention. Good. Started out in 2011 when psychedelics were still quite taboo in the academy. 50 years since the UN Convention on the Misuse of Drugs. And so we called it Breaking Convention, the idea being that 50 years was probably long enough to have a hiatus on psychedelic research. And we put on the conference. We didn't know if anyone was going to turn up, but lots of people did. And so we carried on putting it on. And yeah, we're now in this kind of psychedelic research renaissance in the last decade or so. This is a talk I actually gave last week in Dublin at Trinity College. And I had the good fortune whilst I was there of going to this ancient Neolithic burial chamber. Has anyone been? It's called New Grange. It's 5,500 years old. It's quite amazing. And it's positioned so that on the winter solstice for 17 minutes at that precise point, when the sun comes up in the morning, it shines through that chamber at the top and illuminates. It goes all the way through the passageway and illuminates this chamber at the back. This is quite astonishing bit of acoustic architecture as well, because there's kind of resonant frequency in the back of the chamber, 110 hertz, which if you kind of chant like kind of baritone A or something, you get these standing waves form. And they figured that they probably filled the chamber with incense. And so that moment you'd be in there in the darkness, and that one moment at the middle of winter, the sun would come up and it would light through the passageway and illuminate the chamber. You'd see these concentric rings of smoke forming. And this is kind of like the designs you see, these kind of spirals on all the rock carvings there. And it's said they may have also been inspired by their use of magic mushrooms. And we were, because we had a look in the field right next to it and there was loads of liberty caps growing. And so, yeah, I happened to be in there just as the liberty caps were kicking in and they turned the lights out in the chamber. And that was quite an interesting experience, which led me to think that maybe 5,500 years ago on these lands, people were ingesting psychedelics. And then I found my way to Trinity College and spotted this figure overlooking the college, which is Libertas, and of course she's holding a liberty cap. That's probably by the by. So I don't know how much you know about psychedelic research. A little bit, I hope. A lot of the stuff that was done in the 1950s and 60s, we're using it psychotherapeutically, psychedelic assisted psychotherapy, and using it to treat things like anxiety and depression, addictions, particularly alcohol, but also other drugs, and end-of-life existential fear. And, all that research stopped for about 50 or 60 years. And here we are this time round doing it all again, but with better science to try and convince the regulators that these things have genuine medicinal value and properties. And pretty much most of those studies that have look to see what are the psychological variables that are important in predicting clinical outcomes. Some of them have used what we call the mystical experience questionnaire. It's kind of an abstract idea, isn't it? you know, something like as far out and undefinable as the mystical experience, of course, scientists have found a way to measure, perhaps a bit crudely, but nevertheless, they have measured it. And whenever it is measured in these clinical trials, it reliably relates to clinical outcomes, more so than the dosage of the drug, more so than the intensity of the experience. The mystical experience itself is one of the best and most reliable predictors of clinical outcomes. So the more mystical your experience in psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy, the greater is your reduction of alcohol craving, tobacco craving, depression, anxiety, end-of-life existential fear. But they measure like one kind of mystical experience. It's as defined by scientists. It's a kind of very much a mashup of kind of Abrahamic mystical traditions and Eastern philosophy and religion about the unitive experience. You know, that if you're having a mystical experience and ticking all the boxes on this questionnaire, you'll have had a sense of unity with yourself, with the universe at large. It has a noetic quality. You feel like you're touching into the deep truth underlying the nature of reality, that it has an aspect of the divine to it as well, that you transcend time and space, have deep felt positive mood, love, compassion, awe, bliss, ecstasy, all that good stuff, and that it is ineffable. That is, you can't really put it into words very easily. Quite fitting that we're here in the old divinity school, really, talking about mystical experiences, although this is probably the first time they've had a talk about psychedelics in the old divinity school. I don't know, maybe. But that's just one kind of mystical experience. You know, scholars of mysticism say, you know, there are many types of mystical experiences. So people like Mike Daniels, a colleague of mine, says, you know, conveniently, there are at least 25 different types of mystical experience. And I don't expect you to unpack any of that, but just to show he conveniently has it in this nice 5x5 grid and says, oh yeah, there's exactly 25 mystical experiences you can have. Well, there's probably more. Nevertheless, there are many other kinds of experiences you can have beyond just what we might call mystical with psychedelics. And that's kind of what I'm going to focus on in this talk and say a little bit why they're relevant. What we might call anomalous experiences. There's a branch of psychology called anomalistic psychology, explores mostly why people have these beliefs about anomalous experiences and phenomena. And it might be defined as uncommon experiences like synaesthesia. You all have synaesthesia? You know what synaesthesia is? Some people have synaesthesia. Yeah, good. Probably overly represented here, but that's a nice thing. About 2 to 4% of the population have synaesthesia congenitally, but it, you know, tends to happen a lot with psychedelics as well. So there can be uncommon experiences like synaesthesia, the blending of the senses, or it could be ones that, although may be experienced by a significant number of people, like psi experiences, things like telepathy or clairvoyance, they're believed to deviate from ordinary experience or from usually accepted explanations of reality according to Western mainstream science. So that's the caveat. According to Western mainstream science, these kinds of experiences aren't genuine. You know, what we used to call hallucination. That's just like, oh, you had an experience of telepathy, it's an hallucination. That's a convenient kind of umbrella term to put all of these things under, where we don't have to explain them. We can just explain them away. Another definition of anomalous experiences might be that they are distinct from our ordinary state of awareness or contravene assumptions about reality. But what do we know about reality? You know, what is reality? Anybody hazard to explain what reality is? We don't know. I mean, reality is whatever you can get away with, really. I think Robert Anton Wilson said. But I prefer to use this phrase, exceptional human experiences, which is a kind of big umbrella term for all kinds of weird and wonderful experiences you probably won't see on the back of a toilet door. You know, things like that. I don't know what they might be. Running around with your head on fire or cross-dressing or something like that. I don't know. But probably more likely Kundalini experiences or cosmic consciousness, telepathy, alien abduction, out-of-body experiences, all that kind of weird and wonderful stuff. And so my research over the last 2 decades, I've been publishing and doing reviews and experimental work and surveys and interviews and field work and all kinds of things in all kinds of areas. Things from like the neurodivergent end of the spectrum of the anomalous, so things like synaesthesia, aphantasia, blindness, HPPD, autism, but they're then more kind of exotic experiences like extra-dimensional percepts. What are they? Like the sense of perceiving more than 3 spatial dimensions. Doesn't happen very often unless you've probably inhaled too much DMT, and then in which case it's quite likely you might have some extra-dimensional percepts. Out-of-body, near-death experiences, entity encounters, sleep paralysis, interspecies communication and ecodelic experiences, possession, paranthropy, I can't even say that word, this experience of converting or changing into another species, psi experiences, what we might call telepathy, clairvoyance, precognition, and a very occasionally psychokinesis. Do you want to know what I mean by psychokinesis? Well, telepathy is a direct communication, apparently, of 2 organisms. Clairvoyance is getting information from a distant location. Precognition is seemingly getting information from the future. And psychokinesis is the direct effect on the external material world from one's mind. Anybody here believe in psychokinesis? Please raise my hand. I don't know who did that, but I'll let that fly. And then, of course, mystical experiences and ontological shock. So, you know, I've been trying to cover a lot of areas. And here's the plug. You can find all of that mostly in my fairly recent book, Other Worlds, available at all disreputable online booksellers, and even some good ones. Lots of 5-star reviews on Amazon, most of which I wrote myself. Anyway, I started off this research like 20 years ago by doing a survey. Just basically asked a bunch of psychedelic users, which was very underground back then, I have to say, or actually just general drug users of all kinds, not just psychedelic users. Have you ever had any of these kinds of exceptional experiences under the influence of drugs? And which drugs did you have the experiences? And it turns out, people on like the non-psychedelic drugs, people don't tend to have these experiences. So things like heroin, crack, coffee, alcohol, people don't tend to have telepathic experiences, as you might imagine. Turns out you gaze into the medicine bag for too long, and sure enough, half of all psychedelic users report having had the experience of telepathy, for instance, whilst high. Doesn't mean it's real, but it means psychedelics reliably induce these kinds of experiences more than any other kinds of drugs. And so much so that people like Stan Grof, I don't know if you've heard of Stanislav Grof, he was like considered like the godfather of LSD. He wrote a great book called LSD Psychotherapy. He kind of pioneered psychedelic assisted psychotherapy in the 1950s and 60s in what was Czechoslovakia, and then defected to the States. He, over a 20-year period, he conducted more than 4,000 psychedelic assisted psychotherapy sessions. And, he actually said that he reported observing patients experiencing past life recall, out-of-body experiences, ESP, particularly precognition, accurate remote viewing, and space-time travel on a daily basis. This is his kind of occupational hazard, right, as a psychedelic-assisted psychotherapist, so much so that he catalogued and categorized these different types of experience, and he put them into 3 basic categories. And the first are the experiential extension within space-time and consensus reality. So, pretty far out experiences, but they don't define anything we understand about the nature of reality. So, like what he called things like fetal, embryonal, and phylogenetic experiences. Those kinds of everyday experiences where you feel like you've regressed back all the way back into the womb, and then even further back through your entire genetic history, all the way back to the primordial ooze. You ever get those experiences? Not often, no, I have to say, yeah, but it does tend to occur when you've had a psychedelic experience. So these are pretty far out experiences, but they don't define anything we understand, but potentially about the nature of reality at face value, right? They're just pretty weird. The second category, however, if you take them at face value, do seem to defy those categories, what we call the experiential extension beyond space-time and consensus reality. So what he included things like mental mediumship, apparent communication with the dead, very topical, happy Samhain, Halloween, whatever, All Souls. Encounters with entities, telepathic experiences, which if you take them at face value, seem to defy our usual understanding about the limits of space-time and consensus reality. And then the final category are what I call transpersonal experiences of a psychoid nature, which is a term he nicked from Jung. And psychoids are the external manifestation of one's own inner mental processes. I'm happy to say these experiences don't occur very often with psychedelics and don't occur very often generally, but what might be things like psychokinesis or poltergeist phenomena and so on. So according to Groff, these were a kind of daily occurrence. And although the current psychedelic research endeavor has, made some great headways into exploring the nature of the mystical experience, say, a sense of unity and oneness and all that good stuff, and how that relates to clinical outcomes, nobody's looked to see, well, what happens if you have a telepathic experience or an out-of-body experience? Does that also lead to better clinical outcomes, to better well-being, to better mental health? Nobody's even interested in asking these kind of questions because it's a bit weird, it's a bit too far out. I mean, the fact that the mystical experience itself is being explored within the academy in a serious way in itself is quite radical, right? In that until very recently, this psychedelic research renaissance, the mystical experience was only ever pathologized or demonized, right? And now it's kind of done a complete 180, and it seemed to be part of better mental health and well-being. But what about all these other weird experiences? So I did a survey just this year. I haven't published it yet. And we asked people about their exceptional experiences on psychedelics, that on of a classic unitive mystical experience. And only had about 165 people in the survey. These are the kind of experiences they reported. So, some of them are quite common, you would see. And so, for instance, the majority of people had some kind of out-of-body experience. What else have we got? Entity encounters, healing experiences. Synaesthesia is quite popular. Being outside of time and space seems to be quite common. And then we asked people about their most intense exceptional experience and got them to think about that and say whether or not it affected their well-being, either positively or negatively. And it turns out that people primarily reported these experiences having very positive effects on their well-being by a whole bunch of different indices, particularly, most importantly, enhancing their sense of purpose and meaning in their life, enhancing their sense of connection, enhanced feelings of happiness and well-being, etc., etc. And only a very small percentage reported them having kind of negative effects on their well-being. And they usually boil down to dissociative experiences, people feeling like disconnected after their psychedelic trips, feelings of depersonalization, derealization, dissociation, which, that kind of accords with the kind of numbers we see of people having negative psychological consequences from psychedelic experiences. About 2 or 3% of people will have some psychological difficulties. So these experiences can be good for well-being. They can be quite profound. They can greatly affect your sense of meaning. And they can have big effects on people's worldviews, right? For good or for bad. So in particular, they may affect people's metaphysical orientation, how we perceive, for instance, like philosophy of mind, the nature of mind and body. And what seems to be coming through is that after people take psychedelics, the tendency is for them to move their metaphysics in one direction. That is away from materialist reductionism. Like nobody takes psychedelics and moves away from a different metaphysics towards material reductionism. People move away from the idea that brain produces consciousness and this idea of naturalism, which is kind of, heralded as the kind of belief metaphysics of science, but it doesn't belong to science. Metaphysics and science are separate entities. Unfortunately, most scientists believe that you have to be a materialist reductionist to be a good scientist. That isn't necessarily the case. They're confusing philosophy with science. But after people take psychedelics, they tend to move away from materialist reductionism, the idea that the brain produces consciousness, in any other direction, pretty much, such as panpsychism, the idea that everything is inherently conscious, or idealism, which is even more extreme, that consciousness itself is primary and the material world is secondary, possibly even produced by consciousness, or dualism, the idea that mind and body are separate entities. So we see metaphysical shifts occurring when people have psychedelics. And being in the old divinity school, we also see changes in people's spiritual orientation as well, as you might imagine. So we talk about people having mystical experiences. But what about their prior spiritual beliefs and orientations? So there's been some research in it. I'm going to talk about one particular paper relating to one particular drug and one particular experience, and that is DMT. Has anyone heard of DMT? Oh, yes. Oh, yes. So, DMT is quite extraordinary. It's naturally occurring in nature. It's like we find it almost everywhere in the living world, everywhere we've looked, apart from fungi and insects, weirdly, but certainly not in fungi. Fungi have their own version. It's called psilocybin. And we only find psilocybin in fungi. And we find DMT everywhere else. And we don't find DMT in fungi. And they're closely related chemically. Psilocybin, when it's ingested, actually converts into psilocin. It's a prodrug for psilocin. And psilocin is 4-hydroxy-DMT. It's kind of like a DMT. It's a kind of DMT. It's a fungi DMT, if you like. But DMT, N,N-dimethyltryptamine, is naturally occurring. It's found widely in nature. We find it in mammals. We find it in humans. We make DMT, which is a little bit naughty because it's a Class A drug. And you can get up to a lifetime in prison, a maximum sentence, that is, for producing DMT. But we're all producing it, okay? So we should probably all trot down to whatever the local police station is. And maybe at the end, that'd be kind of fun and maybe a little bit silly. But no, there's something a bit squiffy about the legal situation. We're all producing DMT. If you happen to ingest DMT in some way, you can't actually eat it because we have enzymes in our body which break it down. Monoamine oxidase in our blood, in our stomach. And so, traditionally in the Amazon, they mix DMT with other plants which contain inhibitors for that enzyme and make it orally active. So if you want to take DMT in its pure form, other than injecting it, you would probably vaporize it. Stick it in a pipe, you vaporize it, you inhale it. And if you do it properly, and I can tell you how to do it properly if you're interested, if you do it properly, you only have to take one large inhalation. And by the time you've finished inhaling and start exhaling, you've left this world. You are somewhere else completely. Right? You are no longer here. So it's very, very quick. It's very, very quick. And it's very short acting as well. Only lasts 10 minutes. Right? But it can be a completely mind-blowing, worldview shattering, transformative 10-minute experience if you manage to bring anything back. And one of the most common experiences that people have at high doses, at breakthrough doses of DMT, is they have encounters with some kind of being, right? It's very common, maybe 70, 80, 90% of people on a high dose will have an encounter experience with some kind of entity. Those entities could be of myriad forms, sometimes elves, pixies, gnomes even, all kinds of little people. I'm not going to discriminate. Little people of all types seems to be quite common. Maybe like 10 to 25% of DMT breakthrough experiences involve encountering, or at least 10 to 25% of people who've had DMT breakthroughs have encountered little people. There are many other kinds of forms. It could be angels or aliens or deities, insects, giant praying mantises doing strange operations on your brain and giving you an upgrade. That one weirdly seems to pop up quite a lot for some terrifyingly strange reason. Nevertheless, when people have those experiences, most people come away from that experiencing feeling or believing that those encounters were real, that those entities were real. They have a hyper reality to them. And people often say they were more real than this real, right? They're like, if I was to encounter a DMT entity now, I might come back and think that was more real than you lot. Okay. Sorry, no offense to you lot, but so they have a hyper reality to them. So there was a survey done at Johns Hopkins University where nearly a couple of thousand people had had a DMT entity encounter experience. They asked them about their prior spiritual beliefs and their spiritual beliefs afterwards. And of those people who said they were atheists beforehand, less than half of them remained atheist afterwards. Okay. This is potentially a 10-minute psychedelic experience which can convert more than half of all atheists into non-atheists, just to give you a sense of how intense the experience can be. And I think that suitably earns the description of DMT, which is my favorite. And when you get people to try and describe a DMT experience, probably the one that sums it up best is, I've heard, DMT is a little bit like being punched in the back of the head by God, or so I'm told. So, they can be profoundly spiritually reorientating as well. Other shifts we find are in sense of sentience. How sentient do you view yourself and other things? Right? I don't know how sentient you view yourself. Turns out in this study, they found that not everybody thinks that they are actually sentient themselves, right? Before taking psychedelics. I think it was about 3% weren't sure whether or not they were actually sentient. Turns out everybody thinks they're sentient after taking psychedelics, which is good news, probably. But they also tend to apply more sentience to other things as well, other than them things, including other humans, other primates, other quadrupeds, other animals, insects, fungi, plants, inanimate natural objects like rocks or rivers, and even inanimate man-made objects, right? So yes, after taking psychedelics, there is a tendency to even view plastic bags as more sentient, which might be a bit of a pitfall, right? I don't know. It depends how you feel about plastic bags, really. Anyone here think plastic bags are sentient? You haven't had enough DMT. What's enough? Anyway, so there's a tendency for people's worldviews, beliefs to shift, and they tend to shift in a direction towards what we might consider to be the kind of worldviews of indigenous peoples who have been using these things for thousands of years, who tend to be kind of animist and not materialist reductionists, and of course, indigenous people who have been using these things for thousands of years also tend to be more ecologically orientated as well. if you like. You can think of like the original users of these things the world over are people we might call shamans, right? Shamanism is an ancient practice. It's just a name we apply to a particular set of magico-spiritual practices, which we find from all around the world. The name itself comes from the Tungus tribe, but it's been applied by anthropologists for hundreds of years to people who engage in a particular kind of pagan, animist, magical, spiritual practices, based on the fact that they go into an altered state of consciousness at will in the name of their community to transcend time and space and bring back useful information for their community. That's the definition of a shaman, whatever the local name for them might be, you know, Murakami or whatever. But we find these people the world over, and they still make use of various ways of getting into altered states, be it dancing, drumming, dreaming, diet, or drugs, right? Drugs is just one way of accessing those states. Dreaming is the most popular, followed by drumming. Dreaming you get for free, so why not? Drumming is quite easy to do, it's quite low tech. And drugs are not so common, but that we do find the use of what we call drugs, what they might call plant allies, fungi allies maybe, or teachers the world over, indigenous communities. And shamanism is a kind of nature-based epistemology, right? That is, they come to know the world and obtain knowledge through their engagement with the natural world, often in an altered state of consciousness through the ingestion, sometimes, of psychedelics. And so they have a deep connection with the natural world. So this is something like hippies have been banging on for a long time as well, you know. Take some magic mushrooms, go and hug a tree. Why not? But when I looked into it, there hadn't been any research done on whether or not, well, how psychedelics affect our relationship to the natural world. So I did a kind of rudimentary survey about 10 years ago. There's been some better research done since, thankfully. And I just surveyed 150 psychedelic users, and I said, so has taking psychedelics changed your relationship to the natural world? And this is something you never see in psychological research, or I've never seen, is that you ask 150 people the same question with a range of different answers, and everyone answers the question in the same way. Okay? And that is, it sounds like a bit like a cat food advert, but in our survey, we asked 150 psychedelic users, and they all said that 100% of them said that taking psychedelics had made them feel more connected to nature. So there's a fairly reliable trend there as well. The majority also said they were more concerned for nature, which is probably a good thing, because we are in a bit of an ecological crisis, in case anyone hasn't noticed. Sixth wave of mass extinction and all that. Biggest wave of mass extinction in what, 65 million years or however long it's been, and probably all man-made as well, and probably faster than the previous ones. So it's probably a good thing that there is a means of getting more connected to nature. So that's a good thing, probably, not just because being more connected to nature means we're probably more likely to take care of our environment, but also nature connectedness is a kind of growing area of interest in eco-psychology and psychology, because it's very closely related to well-being. You know, the more connected to nature you are, the better it is for your well-being. The more time you spend out in the natural world, the more engaged you are. For every hour you spend out in the natural world, there's significant reductions in your anxiety. It's related to better well-being generally. So this has, you know, potential knock-on benefits for long-term mental health and well-being as well. But it's not just attitudes. What about people's ecological behaviors? Does it affect that as well? Turns out it probably does, at least by self-report. So we asked our psychedelic users, has taking psychedelics changed any of these ecological behaviors? Just over half of them said that taking psychedelics had made them change their diet. Unfortunately, we didn't ask them what to. That would have been useful. Hopefully, they're not all just eating McDonald's. I hope not. Maybe they're more kind of vegetarian or vegan or freegan or vegan or whatever it is. Maybe they're just eating magic mushrooms for breakfast every day. I don't know. We didn't ask. I should have asked, but never mind. This is my favorite statistic I've ever produced in my career as a scientist. Just over half of them increased the amount of gardening they did because of their psychedelic experiences. And this is what I wanted to have, kind of, this should be like stop press, headline news and tabloids, dangerous psychedelics turn people into rampant gardeners. Didn't happen. It got a kind of like little mention in the back of the Observer once, but that was it. Anyway, so, maybe they're just growing magic mushrooms now. Who knows? More seriously, though, like down the other end of the spectrum, 16% of them changed their career to something more ecologically orientated. For instance, 2 of the sample said they'd quit whatever jobs they were doing to take up PhDs in botany, which I'm told is a dying subject. So maybe it's going to have a revival. Who knows? So that gives me some hope. And then we're obviously interested in, well, what psychedelics are doing this? Which psychedelics in particular? Is it any old psychedelic? Would you care to hazard a guess which psychedelics are the ones that make people feel most connected to nature? Mushrooms, yeah, it turns out. I ask all my audiences this, and everybody goes mushrooms, right? But we did some really nice statistics with a guy at Yale and came up with the same answer, basically, yeah, on loads of different samples. Psilocybin is the one that most reliably predicts increased connection to nature. But what is it about the psychedelic experience? Right, going back to these anomalous or exceptional experiences, it turns out, for instance, that the mystical experience, when measured, is related to changes in ecological behaviors. Those people who experienced a mystical state scored higher on pro-environmental behaviors of eco-shopping and eating. There you go, that's that diet thing again, and one-off domestic conservation actions. So it's like, something about the mystical experience, according to that research. And we did our own research, and based on open text responses and a survey, a few hundred people, and we did this kind of qualitative analysis, and we found that about 2/3 of people who had reported a shift or an increase in their nature relatedness from psychedelics reported transpersonal experiences, i.e. those exceptional experiences. Those experiences, if I can define the transpersonal, those experiences which take us beyond our normal ego, everyday ego identity, into a deeper sense of connection with some kind of other. And for about 2/3 of them, they already had a prior connection to nature. They felt connected to nature. They grew up, surrounded by nature, had a deep connection. But taking psychedelics amplified that connection to nature for them. But in about 1/3 of them, it was like a complete revelation. It's like they felt like they didn't have a prior connection to nature at all. Nature was just like this kind of, wet, windy, abstract backdrop of things that happen out there. And they say things like they went on a psychedelic retreat, they went on a mushroom retreat for the weekend, and it completely changed their opinion. They changed their relationship to the natural world. People working in the city saying they, work in a kind of high-rise office block overlooking London, and they would normally look out and see the city, and there'd be a little park there and a few trees here, but they'd see the city with the kind of nature in the background. They went away on a psilocybin retreat, go back to work the next week, and suddenly they look out the window and they see the natural world with all the man-made, human-made objects suddenly interspersing it. It's like a figure ground flip. It's kind of geshed out. So people are having like big transformations around how they relate to nature, most often through transpersonal experiences. And when we looked into some of those kinds of transpersonal experiences, they're often like feelings of like deep unity or connection, sometimes interspecies communication, feeling like they're having a conversation with things in the natural world, beings not things, beings, like other species, and sometimes even transforming into other species. This might sound a bit far out, but in a previous survey, we asked people about ecologically based psychedelic experiences, like either encounter experiences or visions or even transformations. This is a bit of a hectic slide, but take ayahuasca, for instance. In this survey, 37% of people taking ayahuasca said they'd encountered the spirit or the intelligence of the ayahuasca. They'd had a communication with the plant itself. It's a bit complex because it's a mixture of plants. So which plant are they communicating with? We don't know, presumably the ayahuasca vine, but they felt like they'd had a conversation with the plant. This is what I like the best. A quarter of people had transformation experiences. That is, they felt like they got transformed into another species. That's a quarter of people are taking ayahuasca. It's not something you normally see advertised on ayahuasca retreat brochures, you know. Maybe kind of find some spiritual reorientation or help deal with your mental health issues or boost the KPIs on your new tech app, right? But you don't normally say, yeah, you're probably going to get turned into a jaguar or a lizard or something like that, right? They don't advertise that. But a quarter of people who are taking ayahuasca have had that experience. And that might be a kind of cultural transmission in a way, because, you know, that's part of the cosmology of the Amazonian use of ayahuasca. This idea of you, like, you know, the spirit of the shaman is the jaguar, and the spirit of the ayahuasca is a serpent. Fair enough. So some of that might be just kind of culturally transmitted, primed. But like LSD, you know, came out of a chemistry lab in Switzerland. Right? It's nothing to do. It has no kind of cosmology around transforming into other species associated with it. 10% of LSD users have reported these experiences of being transformed into other species. So it's something like perhaps inherent to psychedelic experiences that can give rise to that. And I think this has got a particular use at this intersection of kind of enhancing connection to nature, but also in creative problem solving as well. So I was lucky enough to run an experiment a few years ago. It was the first clinical drug trial in the UK administering LSD in decades. It was looking at the safety and tolerability of LSD, as if we didn't know it was kind of safe and tolerable because of all the research that had been done over the decades. But nevertheless, we had to do that. And rather than just, you know, waste all that enormous funding doing a very basic LSD study, we thought we'd try and do a conceptual replication of this study done in the 1960s, where they invited in loads of tech professionals, gave them LSD or mescaline, and got them to work on their biggest technical problems. So we did that. We invited, as our participants in this study of a low-dose LSD, Cambridge PhDs in science and Oxford PhDs in science and Imperial PhDs in science, mostly either finished their PhD or at the end of their PhD. Biology, maths, physics, engineering, nuclear fluid dynamics, geology, material science, computer design, I don't know what it might be. Like, so we invite them along to think about their most difficult technical theoretical problem in their expert domain, perhaps their PhD subject, for which they had no answer to that particular problem. And we give them a low dose of LSD to help them think about their problems, their technical problems at least. And then we give them the usual kind of creative problem-solving measures, completely rubbish, didn't really show much. But when we interviewed them all about their experiences afterwards, well, I did anyway, and, you know, whether or not they had had some kind of breakthrough or insight about their theoretical problems. Unfortunately, we haven't published that yet, still working on it. Luckily, at least one or two of the participants have de-embargoed themselves by talking about their experiences, one of which was a biologist who was here at Cambridge. He was working on a particular plant in the Panama jungle. Unlike 99.9% of all of the plants, it doesn't photosynthesize. It has no chlorophyll, right? It's this kind of weird ghost plant. And it seemingly gets all of its energy directly from the mycorrhizal fungus that it grows out of, right? So his PhD conundrum was, what is the nature of this relationship between this rare kind of plant that doesn't photosynthesize and this fungus? Is it that the plant just gets its energy from the fungus and there's nothing in it for the fungus? Is it parasitic or is it symbiotic? And he'd been thinking about this for 3 years, didn't really know. Received wisdom was that it was a parasitic relationship. He came to our lab, he took LSD, and we interviewed him about his experience afterwards. And we said to him, it's like, Merlin, that's his name, Merlin, how was your experience? And he said, well, I turned into the fungus. And we're like, well, that's great. You know, we're pretty sure he didn't because we were watching him, right? Just to check. So he had the experience of turning into the fungus. And so we're like, great, you know, has he had a breakthrough? You know, hoping that's been useful in some way because we were hoping they might have had some insights. And we said, so Merlin, and so how was it? And he said, slimy. And we're like, wow, that was a waste of really good acid because he didn't have much more to say about it than that. It was slimy. Okay. Luckily, Merlin published this great book. Has anyone here read Entangled Life? Brilliant book about fungi. And he talks about his experiences, luckily, in that first chapter, and how it gave him some fresh perspective on this old idea, you know, this problem he'd been working on for 3 years. In that, for the very first time, he saw his problem not as Merlin Sheldrake, the human, but from the perspective of the fungus, right? And that's kind of quite novel because it gave him some insights about what may be going on with the nature of this relationship as he felt he was growing inside the rootstock of the plant. I'm not going to ruin it for you. Read the book if you haven't already. It's a really great book. Royal Society Book of the Year Award, which is kind of amazing because it's effectively just a treatise on animism without using the A word, if you read closely. But it didn't just change his perspective on the nature of his PhD problem, it changed his perspective on how we can do biology and even how we can do science, right? In that our epistemology, the way we obtain knowledge, ordinarily in the kind of scientific secular world is through, you know, empirical science, the deductive, inductive method, hypothesis testing, objectivity, right? We in the West, we try and be as objective as possible when we do science, right? We take our thing, we extract it from its natural environment, usually we atomize it, we desiccate it, we chop it up, we stick it under a microscope, we get as far away from it as possible so we don't bias anything, and we call that objectivity. We call that objective science, which is great for testing ideas and trying to establish, you know, some kind of veracity, like some kind of truth about the nature of our observations. It's good for testing theories. It's not particularly good for developing theories, though, really, or ideas or having insights. Whereas these kinds of psychedelic experiences may be better at generating insights. And it turns out this is exactly what indigenous people do. That is their nature of their epistemology. Like if you want to understand something, if you grow up in the Amazon jungle, if you want to understand something, you turn into that thing, or you get as close to it as possible. You drink ayahuasca and you turn into that thing. You want to know what the medicinal properties of a particular plant are, you sit with it for a month and you drink ayahuasca and you drink nothing but bits of bark from that tree, and you try and become that thing. Right? It's a complete opposite of objective science. It's like hyper subjectivity instead of objectivity. And I'm not necessarily saying one is better than the other. I think classic science, objectivity is brilliant for deducing, you know, testing ideas, hypothesis testing, but not necessarily good for generating insights. And I think these two things could work better in concert, right? Particularly around ecological issues, around biological issues, of anything to do with the natural world in a way, because like thinking like humans has got us into a massive ecological crisis. if you hadn't noticed. And as, what was it, Einstein once said, the kind of thinking that got you into a problem is not the same kind of thinking that's going to get you out of that problem. So maybe it's a time to think more open-mindedly and utilize indigenous epistemologies and how we come to problem solve our technical issues like ecological crisis. Because it turns out that's how indigenous people do it. It's called perspectivism, according to the anthropologist Eduardo Vivero de Castro. That's how indigenous people obtain their knowledge. So I think like what Merlin's done, and by his taking, this is, by the way, anyone know what this is? It looks like the slug version of the fungus growing on his book, but this is actually ergot, from which we get LSD, which is also a kind of fungus. So maybe this kind of epistemology could be beneficial. Anyway, I'm gonna wrap it up, but saying that, so psychedelics can have very profound shifts in our worldview, induce extremely wild experiences, which may challenge our prior worldviews, and which can be, generally speaking, quite positive if that happens. However, worst case scenario, people can have extended psychological difficulties from psychedelic experiences. We've been running the Challenging Psychedelic Experience Project at Greenwich for 2 or 3 years now. Hadn't been much research on this until recently. Everyone was very happy to talk about all the positive benefits of psychedelics, but there are negative consequences for a small minority as well. And so we found about 10% of people may have a challenging experience, what we used to call bad trips. We don't call them that anymore. It doesn't sound very scientific, but challenging experiences. And of those, about 10% may have extended psychological difficulties, not usually classic psychosis, but, you know, things like dissociation, depersonalization, derealization. And when we looked at the kinds of things that people reported, emotional difficulties, anxiety, dissociation, but also half of all the people that had extended difficulties reported ontological shock, okay? Like challenges with their worldview based on their experience, often like cognitive dissonance between their prior worldview and the worldview that their psychedelic experience presented to them. You know, for instance, if you've been turned into a mushroom, that might challenge your prior worldview about the nature of the limits of experience. And that they may be the experiences that people struggle to integrate and therefore have kind of extended psychological difficulties with. Anyway, I'm going to summarize it by saying these exceptional experiences are actually relatively common. They're not necessarily delusional. They may even be fruitful or useful if they give us insights. They can also be transformative. It could be beneficial for well-being and mental health. They can inform our understanding of the neurobiology of exceptional experiences. Like we can understand out-of-body experiences better by studying psychedelic-induced out-of-body experiences, for instance, because we can understand some of the underlying neurochemistry. They can help us understand the full spectrum of human psychology and human experience instead of just cutting off a whole section at the end and calling it hallucination and not exploring it. Give us insights perhaps into ontology, like the nature of reality, because we haven't really worked out what that is yet. If anybody understands reality, do let me know. I'm open to be convinced. And they also give us a repeatable means for exploring consciousness, the mind-body problem, bizarre phenomena like psi and synaesthesia and so on. So that's pretty much my talk. This is the thank you slide. There's my book again. And that's it. Thank you very much. Do you have some questions or answers or just jokes or comments or insults? I'll take anything at this point. Yes.
How like predict or predict like the outcome or the experience that you're gonna have with psychedelics. I mean, so but I was reading somewhere it's about settings, so like the mindset you have going into it and the physical environment.
To some extent, yeah, set and setting is important. And in classically in psychopharmacology, the study of drugs that affect the mind, you just think about the substance, right? You think about its chemical structure, its potency, its like dosage, its purity, all of those kind of things around the substance itself. And that's the important information you need, which kind of works fairly well for most psychoactive drugs, but psychedelics kind of throw those rules out the window, really. And researchers took a little while to realize that. And initially, when psychiatrists got hold of psychedelics in the 1950s, they figured, they'd not long discovered the first neurotransmitter, serotonin. They saw that it was structurally similar to the shape of LSD, and they figured, great, we can understand, mental health issues by studying neurochemistry, right? And they figured that psychedelics could help us understand psychosis in particular. They figured that, psychedelics were a neurobiological model of psychosis. And they figured that because they gave people LSD without any preparation in this one study. They locked them in a room, handcuffed to a bed, on high doses of LSD, and observed people having psychotic reactions, right? It's like everyone's having a psychotic reaction to this drug, therefore it mimics psychosis, and they called them psychotomimetics. They called LSD a psychotomimetic. It mimics psychosis, right? Then, people like Timothy Leary came along at Harvard and did these experiments where he put people he gave them some preparation, told them what they might expect, put in a room with some nice soft furnishing and some groovy lighting and some funky music and a lovely fluffy therapist. And, the majority of people had a very, very positive experience, which didn't look like a psychotic reaction. So yes, set and setting are probably more important than the substance itself, right? So setting, and substance, those three things determine the kind of experience you're going to have with the psychedelic. It's not entirely predictable, though. If you pay attention to set and setting, you're more likely to have a positive experience. And so we do see that. For instance, if you look at the trends of people who have extended psychological difficulties from a psychedelic bad trip, it tends to be those people doing it in uncontrolled environments. You're more likely to have extended difficulties if you don't know what drug you've taken. Surprise, surprise. If you don't know what the dosage is, also more likely to have extended difficulties, but also in uncontrolled environments. And also being of a younger age, like adolescents are more likely to have challenging psychological issues. Underlying individual differences as well. So people who have higher on neuroses, are going to be having more likely to have it. More underlying anxiety, you're more likely to have a challenging experience. Although paradoxically, at the same time, in controlled clinical environments, you can treat people's anxiety with psychedelics. But if you've got a lot of anxiety going into it and it's an uncontrolled environment, it might give you a negative experience. So yeah, we're beginning to understand some of the kind of predictors, but they're kind of quite common sense, really. If you don't pay attention to set and setting, you're more likely to have a bad trip. Yeah, just that. Yeah, that's it.
Yeah, it's sort of a follow-on question from that. In terms of, I was wondering about the particular belief or personality predictors of these exceptional experiences. Because we're talking about rationalist materials, I sort of regard myself as very much so on that.
Good,
that
that's no bad thing.
And all the other people are encountering Mother Ayahuasca, and I'm just like, well, it sounds like bollocks to me. And also DMT, coming into contact with entities. I would never, under any circumstances, have thought that was real.
Mm-hmm. But you had encounters. But you had an encounter. Right.
Those circumstances, but I think that's real. And I guess similar with the Roman Griffiths study, you cited where 50% of them stop being atheists. I think in that, didn't they have even though they were atheists before, they had maybe a religious background. I understand.
Potentially, I don't know. I didn't look into that, but yeah.
Yeah, so I guess I'm just wondering in all of these studies when you looked at, okay, are there certain other predictors of the belief in these perceptions?
It hasn't been looked into much, to be honest with you, like particular predispositions, personality, cultural orientation. But yeah, for sure, like prior orientation is probably going to have an effect on experience. So like also at Johns Hopkins, you know, they did those mystical experience experiments, right? And they took people who had prior spiritual practice, they give them a high dose of psilocybin, and like 2/3 of them had like a full-blown mystical experience, okay? In other studies where they've used, you know, very secular atheist participants, and also the researchers themselves weren't particularly orientated in that direction, they'd only get like 1/3 of people would have a mystical experience. So, you know, some of it's the experience itself, it would seem, but there are like prior orientation, cultural factors as well, which probably mediate how likely you are to have a mystical or exceptional experience. For sure, no doubt, no doubt. These things don't occur in a cultural vacuum, definitely not. But it could also be a usage thing, you know, like if you take psychedelics a lot, it might start to erode your worldview at some point, right? I don't know. It's like I've got some die-hard materialist reductionist friends who, you know, after a while they kind of start scratching their chin and like, I had an experience and I'm not sure it really fits with my worldview. And they're kind of a bit edgy about telling me about it. You know, it's like, and I'm still a materialist reductionist and everything, but like this experience did challenge my worldview. So like these, I think you're more like, you know, over time, you may have experiences which make you question your worldview. It doesn't mean that you have to change your worldview or your worldview is wrong, or, you know, those psychedelic experiences could just be like delusion, right? But we don't know what reality is. So like, you know, keep an open mind. And I try and be agnostic. It's not very easy. Yeah, I mean, what we don't know is the metaphysical positions we take. And I think it's useful to have a metaphysical position, but like beliefs are prisons, aren't they? Really? Because our convictions make us convicts, as Robert Anton Wilson once said. So I think it's up for grabs. Reality is up for grabs. I don't have any. Anyway, I'm going to stop ranting now. But yeah, thank you for adding that. Yeah, we'll come back to you.
Give that experience and configuring privacies to private goals and themselves and use that to various psychedelics offer experience and control setting.
You mean like trepanation? There's like there is a kind of ancient practice, isn't there, which we find in various parts of the Neolithic world. Probably one of the oldest surgical practices of boring holes into the skull. Is that what you mean?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think I call it trepanation, which, you know, acquired a bit of a negative connotation in medicine in, you know, recent years, largely because when 19th century doctors tried doing trepanations, they tended to kill the majority of their patients. Whereas the ancients, it turns out, if you study the kind of archaeology of the skulls, it turns out about 90% of them survived the operation in the various parts of the world where it's conducted, which would seem to indicate that they probably had some kind of antiseptics in these Neolithic cultures. Otherwise, not so many people would have survived. Anyway, like trepanation is a really interesting one. I don't know whether it necessarily does induce near-death experiences. There's a really wonderful woman who kind of single-handedly helped revive the psychedelic renaissance in the UK, based in Oxford, called Amanda Fielding, who's now in her 80s. She set up this organization called the Beckley Foundation, and they funded all the initial studies that were conducted at Imperial College, looking at psychedelic neuroscience, you know, a decade ago. and she still continues to work. And when she was in her early 20s, she actually trepanned herself as an art project. She couldn't get a medical doctor to do it, so she drilled a hole in her head herself with a dentist drill and filmed it. It's quite a good little film, actually, if you're not too queasy. Especially considering she's wearing this amazing, looks like a white dress, and she's got sunglasses taped to her head so the blood doesn't go in her eyes. And you see the point in which the drill goes through the skull without piercing the blood-brain barrier. I don't think she had a near-death experience. And I'm not sure trepanation does induce near-death experiences. She managed to convince about 100 people to self-trepan. She actually ran for Parliament on trepanation for the NHS. Didn't get elected, interestingly enough, but she did manage to convince about 100 other eccentrics to drill holes in their head throughout the 1970s and 80s. And I don't know if any of them actually had. I mean, if you're having a near-death experience, you probably drilled too far, is my guess. So I don't know, but she did say it was rather like having a couple of glasses of sherry the whole time. So it gave her a kind of an expanded state of consciousness, but not necessarily a full-blown mystical experience. But there isn't much kind of research on that particularly. Nevertheless, the near-death experience has become quite popular as a phenomena since the advent of, resuscitation techniques, which weren't very well known until the last few decades. So chances are, if you had a heart attack 30, 40 years ago, there's very little chance of surviving. If you have a heart attack now, there's still a pretty high percentage chance you're going to die, but more people survive heart attacks these days. And of those who do, some of them tend to report near-death experiences. Do you know what a near-death experience is? More or less? It's kind of classic. There's a kind of a bit of a syndrome. Not everybody has all the features, but the general kind of experience is that, some life-threatening accident happens. Maybe you got hit by a car. Usually the first thing that occurs is you feel like you're having an out-of-body experience. You're looking down at your body. You go, oh no, what am I doing down there in front of that car, bleeding? I must be dead. Then you usually have a kind of like life review. Your whole life flashes before you. You go, oh no, not that thing. Oh no, not that thing again. Like all the things in life you didn't learn from and kept repeating. Then there's usually like a tunnel of light, and you move down the tunnel of light. You're moving towards the end of the tunnel of light, and you're gonna merge with the light, and it feels quite ecstatic. You're just about to merge with the light, and then one of your dead relatives pops up and goes, "Oh no, it's not your time. You've got to think of the kids." And back into your body just as you get resuscitated by the paramedics. Well, that's a classic near-death experience, right? We've all been there. Has anyone had a near-death experience like that? No. That's probably a good thing. And there is a sense in which they do seem to overlap a little bit with psychedelic experiences. So Pascal Michael, I think he was going to come and speak. As my PhD student. He did his PhD on the relationship between DMT experiences and near-death experiences. And there does seem to be some kind of overlap in the phenomenology, but it's not the same. It's not the same necessarily. And there are theories that the brain releases DMT at the point of death. And, well, it might well do, but I don't think that's the full explanation for near-death experiences either. I could go into that more, but I think I'm going to leave it there. But thank you for that question. I went off on a lot of tangents right there. Does anyone else got any questions before we go to my guest?
I hear a lot of anecdotal reports from friends who say that natural drugs or psychedelics like psilocybin gives them a stronger connection to nature as opposed to synthetic ones. And
thank you.
But I'm a little bit skeptical of there being a real fundamental difference between natural and synthetic psychedelic. And I'm curious to hear what you think about that. Does the natural psychedelics offer any more kind of intrinsic value, or do they have special source?
Yes, that's a really good question. I was trying to see if I had a slide here handy, but I haven't. What we tended to find that was the more organic based ones tend to induce more nature connectedness. So actually psilocybin. DMT, weirdly, although because DMT on its own is usually, most people, it's an extract like a chemical extract from a plant source. So it's like not fully synthetic or fully organic. LSD also made people fairly connected to nature, whereas very synthetic drugs like ketamine in particular, but also MDMA, didn't particularly make people very connected to nature. In fact, ketamine, people reported that they felt less connected and less concerned for pretty much everything, you know, like having out-of-body experience, but especially the natural world. So there is a correspondence between, like, yeah, people feel more connected to nature with the kind of more natural whole plant or whole fungus psychedelics than they do with purely synthetic ones. But that might be just a suggestion. You know, it could be that you take mushrooms and you maybe have to go out into nature to pick them, whereas you just get your ketamine from the dark web or someone in the pub, right? It's not kind of, you're not really, it depends how you source them. That might have something to do, but it's also your ideas about it, like, oh, mushrooms are very natural, you know, it kind of gives you more of a kind of nature connectedness experience. It's hard to know what's mediating that. And I imagine some of it's going to be cultural, some of it's going to be psychological, and some of it could be inherent to the substance. And so it is a question. And of course, like, people say that, you know, taking magic mushrooms would be a very different experience to taking synthetic psilocybin. It's hard to put that to the test, right? I mean, I've had both. You know, I was injected with psilocybin in the lab, and it felt pretty much like magic mushrooms to me, right? You know, it was like very, very quickly having a very kind of cosmic experience, which I could go into, but I won't. But it's hard to discern, isn't it? And there's an argument that, you know, whole substances, there's other things going on because you may have other alkaloids in them as well, what we call the entourage effect. So for instance, like psychedelics like mescaline, you eat a peyote cactus, primarily the alkaloids in peyote are mescaline, like 90% of the psychoactive alkaloids are mescaline, but it's also got dozens of trace psychoactive phenethylamines like MDMA antagonists, MDMA analogs, like, so things that like MDMA, which kind of like you might be able to also feel. So it's hard to know, like, you're going to get a different experience perhaps from eating peyote than you would from just having mescaline. So like it's confounded by those kind of factors as well. But it'd be good to do a kind of Pepsi challenge with people. I actually did something similar because a lot of, you know, people, hippies, let's call them, or spiritual people who like psychedelics, would often go on about how they would only take 5-MeO DMT from toad venom. They would never think of taking synthetic 5-MeO DMT. I actually kind of got data from two different sources, put them together side by side, and in terms of how mystical the experience is, they look identical, which I think is a good argument because you may want to get your organic 5-MeO DMT, but 90% of 5-MeO DMT from cane toads is being supplied by narcos, like drug cartels in Mexico, who are just kind of mass farming toads in 5-MeO DMT factories and abusing those poor little amphibians, right? So like, yeah, you might go, oh, I want to get my spiritual experience from a kind of organic source, but you might be torturing some poor toads to get it, right? So I'd actually say in those cases, you probably want to be having a synthetic psychedelic experience because it doesn't have all that bad toad karma attached to it, right? So, yeah, I mean, it's an open question. Supposedly, right, when Albert Hofmann, Swiss chemist, isolated psilocybin and psilocin from Psilocybin mexicana that came from the Mazatec Indians in Mexico. He synthesized it, he made some capsules, and he sent some with the Wassons back to Mexico. They ended up with Maria Sabina, this Mazatec shamaness. It was out of mushroom season, because they only go in the wet season, and she took the capsules of synthetic psilocybin, and she said, these are my little children. Like, these are the spirits. Like, she referred to the mushroom spirits as her little children. And she said, taking synthetic psilocybin was good enough for her. So, you know, what do hippies know, basically? No, that answers the question, maybe. Do you have time for another question? One last question? Thank you. And then I think we should probably go to the pub.
What we call animism when you think about kind of like mother and child experience. I mean, I would really explain what that like is, and then how is entangled life like abiding with that.
So animism could be loosely, I mean, it's quite akin to panpsychism. I think, like, thank you. Like, panpsychism is like a kind of metaphysical position, isn't it, on the nature of consciousness? But most panpsychists kind of tend to draw the line at plastic bags having consciousness, right? You know, it's like, and it's a bit of a philosophical discussion. Whereas, you know, an animist tend to believe that everything is inherently conscious, but that aggregate objects and organisms have their own particular kind of consciousness. So, cheers, thank you. So, like a river may be conscious, or a waterfall may be conscious, or a whirlpool may have its own consciousness, or a rock may have its own consciousness. Usually, panpsychists don't, you know, the metaphysical position, philosophical position doesn't apply consciousness to whirlpools or waterfalls, but an animist might. Okay, so that usually there are spirits of nature. No, what we call spirits, they would call whatever they call it in their language, right? And it doesn't really translate to the idea of spirits particularly, but that there is a kind of essence in things and in beings that you can have a relationship with. It's about relationality, really. And that's kind of what's embedded within shamanism. It's about relationships with other than humans, be it, you know, the spirit of the tree or the jaguar or the stars or the waterfall, or you can have communications with all those things. So that's kind of it. But like, I think maybe to say Melanie Sheldrake's book was a treatise on animism, might be taking it a bit far, but is certainly open to that. And it's probably, you know, more of a treatise on panpsychism in a way, because it explores, you know, these limits of definitions of consciousness and where do we draw the line? Where do we draw the line of being as well? I don't know if you read the book. It's a really great book. Particularly love the stuff about lichens. Anyway, should we draw a line there? I think everyone's disappearing. That probably means that we should go to the pub. Thank you so much, everybody. That's incredible.
I did a PhD in psychiatry here.
Oh,
in
great.
Cannabis and psychedelics.
Oh, wow.
Doing the postdoc mostly on psychedelics, and people can do.
No, I don't need to. It is on there.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Postdoc here.
Oh, great. Sure. Thank you. Yeah, sure. I can have, I mean, I'm probably have done this year off. Oh, but I can help point you in some right direction. Yeah, sure. Absolutely, sure. Yeah.
Very good.
Yeah. Yeah.
Thank you.
Right. Yeah, for sure. There are quite a few of them, but happily I'll tell you what I know.